at Prosper Portland. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Christina.
Hi, everyone. Christina Gann, she, her, and I'm with Commissioner Rubio's office here to listen in.
Great, thank you. And I saw Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jeff Cottle. I'm an environmental planner at BPS, and I have been working on floodplain work, and I'm starting to focus a little bit more on the North Reach. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, Jeff. And Marie, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too. Marie Walkowitz, she, her pronouns. I work at Bureau of Environmental Services and am a liaison between BES and BPS on planning projects.
Great. Glad you're here. Thank you. And Daniel.
Hello, Daniel Sebbing, City of Portland, Planning and Sustainability. I'm working on environmental overlay zones in conjunction with the EOA.
Great, thank you all. I think that's everyone online, and I'll start maybe with Steve. Would you mind going there?
I'm Steve Kuntz, City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm a senior economic planner here.
And good morning. I'm Patricia Diefender for she, her pronouns. I am the chief planner here at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, working on many of our long-range planning efforts.
Great.
I am Bob Salinger, and I'm the conservation manager at Willamette River Keeper.
Corky Collier with Columbia Corridor Association and the Swan Island Business Association.
The Working Waterfront Coalition. Hi, Ellen. Good to see you.
Steph Rouse, Planning Commission.
Okay.
Coffee and water, restrooms down the hall. Leave them. Should you send a note to the group?
I did. Yeah. Okay, folks online, we're running it through the audio through my laptop. So hopefully you can hear, we'll speak up in the room, and you can see the presentation because we'll run it from my laptop, which doesn't do us much good here in the room. Here. All right, we now have this up in the room so everyone can see the presentation. The mic is still through my computer until it reboots. So we can get going. Or I think it's Jay. Shay, can you hear us?
Yep, we can hear you now.
You want to, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I was trying to share screen, but I couldn't with the other one up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm gonna get some slides up. So thanks for your patience while I do that. Let's see. Can everybody see that okay?
Can you give us a minute?
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, I don't have much time, so I'm gonna go pretty quick. And I know I see a lot of friendly faces in the room who might have seen all this before. So I'm gonna go through this a little faster so we have more time for questions and so that we have.
Shay,
Yeah.
can you just wait 1 minute? We're gonna try and switch again.
Okay.
There, I guess you wasn't. Gonna want to update. You know it's gonna want to update. Oh, there we go. All right, Shay, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Well, everybody, so this is normally it's a longer presentation, so I'm going to breeze through some of the context settings. So if you do have questions around that, feel free to hit me up, or we can send the full presentation after. But essentially, just today, we're going to go over a little bit of the strategy and context. I really want to spend time on the fact that this is a living plan, that we're getting some work done. So I want to be clear around what we've implemented since this plan got adopted in April, and then leave some time for questions. Just in terms of some context, this work took years of engagement and work with both local consultants and some of the best that we have across the nation. Lots of engagement with both industry, diverse groups across geographies. So all of that's informing this work. It lives in context with other regional plans that we have. It's influenced by city level growth strategies and management strategies, by our regional work with the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, which happens on a regional level through GPI. And obviously EOA is another way that we try to connect this work to the city. And then in terms of the analysis, it really looked to some of the strengths and weaknesses of Portland, really tried to tell this narrative in the moment that we are coming out of the pandemic and into recovery. So knowing that we have had, we're in this moment that without significant intervention, we're seeing that Portland's economic growth is poised to stagnate or even decline, right? And so what you'll see as a theme throughout the plan is this idea that we will not achieve racial equity or climate goals if we're not also embracing economic growth, and that the growth will not even be as robust or as vibrant if we don't actually have this racially inclusive and climate focused approach. And so the key findings of the assessment looked at some of those longer term trends, some of the trends around skilled labor and what's happened in terms of this history of attraction and kind of this like talent attraction model. As well as kind of what have our strengths been in terms of our key competitive advantages as a region. We also looked at some of the challenges, and I think we kind of hold this hypothesis that over the last decade, this rapid growth that we had in terms of talent-based attraction, it really dwarfed our ability to address some of the key fundamentals that are necessary and part of the economy, and that we just weren't able to adequately manage the scale of this growth. And so a lot of the consequences that we see today, whether it's the median home prices, or we're looking at the racial disparities in some of our income data, a lot of that is due, and especially certainly with the crisis on the street, right, around affordability. A lot of that can be seen as we have grown quite a bit, and we know that these challenges persist. We also know that the challenges are very specific to parts of the city, and so a lot of the data and work that went into this was being, boots on the ground, going into specific corridors. We worked with Equa Northwest to look at a lot of the real estate data across different sub-districts across the city. And so we know in the post-pandemic world, this is not the same. We have different stories happening across the city. And so we identified through these typographies which areas are still challenges, which are bright spots, where do we need to have different strategies for areas that are declining or some that are stabilizing, some that are growing. But I think ultimately we know that we can't take growth for granted, and we had population decline for the first time in 40 years, right? And that's a huge threat to our economic future. There's huge concerns around the tax value proposition of the city and eroding livability concerns, and as well as I think huge increase in business taxes since 2019. And a lot of these, for those of you maybe who are serving on the governor's downtown task force, these are themes that are coming up there as well. And we know office vacancy, decrease in daytime population downtown, all of that's a factor. Again, sorry, I'm trying to skip through all these, but please put questions in the chat if you have questions around the context. And so this is our goal, really moving to that sustained quality growth where we're embracing equity as a core driver, climate as an equitable growth opportunity, and then obviously centering the growth of our key industries where we are competitive. So these are our goals. Inclusive economic growth, equitable wealth creation, fostering diverse, vibrant corridors, commercial districts, and then a theme around workforce development. In terms of that, we also got, I think I'm going to skip through these. These are just kind of how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. How do we measure success? What are those metrics? As well as what's the timeline? This is a 5-year plan, so there's implementation activities that are laid out for the next half decade. And again, it's meant to serve as a broader growth strategy for the city. And then finally, I think, let's get into, this is our advisory committee. I think we might have some overlap in this room, where we certainly have overlap of folks who contributed to this plan here. And then, I want to get into the meat of it. I'm sure that's where most of folks' questions are. So I'm going to pause here, go through the high-level themes of each objective. So when we're talking about objective 1, I think that this pertains to a lot of the folks who are in this conversation today, and this is around inclusive economic growth and innovation. We're talking primarily about our industry clusters here. Where are we most competitive advantage? Where do we have the most competitive advantage? Where do our location quotients show that we are either growing or have a substantial opportunity? And so we are firmly focusing on the athletic and outdoor, the green cities, or what we call climate tech, metals and machinery, even though we've seen a decrease, and I think that's a relevant conversation today around, we do see some shrinking and decrease in the metals and machinery and kind of industrial fabrication sector. But we still recognize it as a crucially important industry for our city in terms of retaining middle wage jobs and jobs that are more accessible for our communities of color and folks that face high barriers to employment. So even though it is shrinking, it's a huge priority for us in terms of retaining the legacy and supporting where we can. We have a new focus on food and beverage manufacturing. That's never been a focus of the city, even though we think food, both culturally and economically, are an important part of the city's vibrancy, as well as a good play for founders in the space and CPGs. And we historically focused on tech, but we're looking at tech differently in terms of software. It's more of a cross-cutting cluster whose success depends on the rest of our agencies, the rest of our industries doing well. I think our concentration in the tech sector looks a little different than most cities on the West Coast. So I have a different approach there. So again, looking at those traded sector clusters, looking at specific strategies around green products and services, and then looking at barriers, right? And so you'll see a few that we're tackling there as first steps. Around equitable wealth creation, a lot of this, I think it's more centered on the small business side of things, around starting, but then also scaling small, diverse businesses into traded sector businesses. There's also opportunities in real estate, bid opportunities for BIPOC firms and individuals. And then we know that the city charter restructuring is a huge opportunity to reshift and centralize how we approach supporting small businesses. We know it's a fraught landscape with lots of different touch points. And so there's a lot of interest in this right now from our implementation committee, from the public, from certain stakeholders, to say, like, can we start centralizing how the city serves small businesses? A couple here on the city center, acknowledging the central city plays a key role in the region's economy, our long-term health, and knowing that we have to have a better mix of uses in the downtown core. And so those strategies are different based on those sub-districts and their individual mixes of residential. And right now we know there's some imbalance coming out of the pandemic and knowing that remote work is so heavy. Big focus on commercial activity in the central city, public-private partnerships around infill and development of large-scale mixed use. I think that's a really good conversation for EOA. And then obviously a big focus on, our reputation coming out of the pandemic is also taking a hit. So a lot of our focus is on events and activation in the downtown space. Similarly, I think we need to look separately at downtown in some of our districts. And so mainly looking to support the health of districts as well, not just in the central city. We know there's a problem with vacant storefronts, community serving businesses attracting that commercial development. We need tools, we need resources to do that. And so you'll hear about how we're approaching that with new TIP districts just in a second. I think if we go ahead and then on the workforce side as well, knowing that connecting folks to jobs in high quality future ready sectors is a huge focus, knowing that we can and have the opportunity to expand workforce training programs, especially related to the clean economy, knowing that there's such an increase of funding on the federal side, but also knowing that PSEF is just had its CIP approved, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, and how that's going to start having impacts on our workforce sector. And then public-private partnerships. I think a huge theme throughout this is kind of the work we're doing today, that the EOA is doing, is getting back to private sector leadership in this space and how industry-led consortia and bringing folks together, particularly in support of the clean economy. Again, it's important. And then obviously, I think we know that there's a jobs housing mismatch that's growing as we see income disparity grow in East Portland and how the concentration of jobs continue to shift from where we have centers of poverty. So again, that's super quick overview of some of the research and some of the grounding in the plan. I do want to focus on kind of where have we started the work now. So in terms of year one, here are some of the things that are in process or have been completed. Celebrating BPS and their work for the Clean Industry Initiative. We've managed to put together a public-private proposal that we're hoping will get funded with EDA. That's with VirtuLab, so focused on the climate tech sector with PSU, knowing that we have to build more bridges between our industry and academia. We're looking at an ordinance at City Council around permitting. I think that passed. We're working on one that potentially could shift the way that City Council approaches kind of new laws or ordinances or new policy that would require us to think about the impact to the private sector. Right now, when new policy is taken, we have to be very explicit about what's the impact to the city's revenue, what's the impact to communities, what's the impact, what's the equity impacts. But right now, there's no mechanism by which we can say, and then here's the impact to the private sector. And so we want to make sure that we start doing that as a city practice. It's a bit of culture change. Sam mentioned this issue around, or this energy around using the city charter restructuring as a moment to think about how we serve small businesses. There's quite a lot. Obviously, I encourage you to look at the website of Advanced Portland. There's a lot of objectives, and so just objectives that we're tackling now, it's pretty substantial. But I want to focus on a few of those specifically because I think they're relevant to this conversation. I know we only have a minute or so. I think we talked about the clusters, but I want to highlight a few things that the team has been working really hard just to do in the last few months. I've never seen our council act with such expediency when it comes to implementing plans like these. So just to start off, within a couple months of implementing the plan, we launched a new E-zone, an enterprise zone, which is a 5-year tax abatement for the East Portland area. So, and you can see the maps here, how much of it covers of our industrial corridors. Again, 5-year tax abatement, it's our primary tool that we have, at least in-house in our team, in terms of an incentive. And then shortly after that, we passed for East Portland. For the very first time, we did an amendment that includes now all of downtown. So all of downtown Portland is now part of an enterprise zone, and you could have up to 5-year tax abatement on new investments in that area, pending that it meets a lot of the job requirements. Similarly, we worked with the mayor's team and huge appreciation to Andrew Fitzpatrick over there for his leadership on a downtown business incentive credit. So this is around the business license tax. We're hoping that this can be another catalyst that will drive some investment downtown, or at least support some of the employers that are down there specifically that we know are having a hard time. And then in terms of funding these potential initiatives and knowing that we have both the focus on downtown, the corridors, certainly our industrial sectors, we are looking at multiple new tax increment finance districts. City Council recently instructed us as Prosper Portland to work with city partners, the Housing Bureau certainly, to explore several new tax increment finance designations for the central city as well as in East Portland. So it's a huge body of work. For context, we didn't have new TIF districts in the city of Portland for well over a decade, with the exception of last year. For the first time, we had a new TIF district launched in the Cully neighborhood. And so now we're looking at 3 in East Portland. You can see we're considering one along 82nd Avenue, really to match the investments that are coming in from the transportation side, seeing if we can leverage TIF as a way to stabilize community there, knowing that those transportation improvements can create tremendous displacement pressure. We're also looking some at east of 205, where we're, again, building on the capacity we have with local organizations there that have built up over time. And then we're also looking to include kind of the Park Rose and Columbia Corridor area on the north side of East Portland, knowing that that's where, increased industrial land and jobs, and making sure that residential and industrial lands are included as part of this planning and potential tools that could come from it. And then lastly, I'll just point out we're looking at several areas across downtown. I think most folks, there's a lot of energy and attention around this, knowing the state of our downtown and how we need additional tools and investments. So we're moving forward with utmost expediency around these potential districts and the resources that they can create for all these initiatives, but specifically for redevelopment. So I'm going to pause. I think, how am I doing on time, Tom?
You're right at time. Oh. You mute yours, Tom.
Yeah.
That's Are we good?
Yeah.
You're right at time. Thank you, Shay, for working with our technical difficulties this morning and giving us some context for the employment forecast that we'll be talking about here in a minute. Anyone have questions online or in the room? I see a hand in the room. I'll take it. Bob.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I also read through it online as well. One of the things I noted, despite all the commitment to integration of climate issues and green economy, as far as I can tell on a list that's huge, you don't have a single environmental interest involved in the development of this plan, not one. And I'm curious one, am I misreading it? And 2, can you speak to that a little bit? Because to me, this is a fundamental problem that we see over and over and over again, is this commitment to green economy and environment. But when it comes time to develop a plan like this, somehow you can have 50, 60, 70 people on it. And this also goes for the downtown planning process that the governor has put together, not a single environmental interest. So can you speak a little bit to the thinking behind that? And I know that's
No, it's a great question. No, it's a fantastic question. I think, one, we were very fortunate to have the close partnership of BPS on the planning on this around the Clean Industry Hub and really on the whole plan, which was excellent. Certainly engaged with a lot of folks in the sector. I think, while we hold that the city has its climate plan and that's a separate but important effort, this is really looking at the economic fundamentals and how do we center growth in our city. And so when we're looking at climate, we're not necessarily looking at the environmental interests. We're looking at how do we use and look at the climate as an opportunity to grow our local industry, and then we can have an outsized impact, not just on ourselves, but on the planet, right? I think of good example is we have startups now happening here in Portland that we are supporting and trying to support that are doing things like building some of the most innovative and successful fleet of outboard motors, right? To electrify some of the operations that happen in the nautical sector, right? So we're looking at it from like a climate tech perspective, really what's the growth opportunity for the city, knowing that there are innovations and funding that are coming from the federal government and other places. So I think that's an important distinction of how we're looking at it as an economic development agency. I think there are other spaces and other tables that are important for considering. I think the Climate Industry Hub is an important one that gets called out. Certainly that's around decarbonization, but also what's the economic opportunity around decarbonization, right? How are we supporting some of our larger emitters to seize the moment and explore what it looks like to make their operations cleaner, but there's also more competitiveness around becoming cleaner. So I just think it's a distinction there, and we know that some of that work happens elsewhere across the city.
All right, thank you, Shay. I see a question in the chat, and Corky, I'll get to you in just a second. What are the stats on the Cully TIF district impacts, positive or negative, in the first year? Any
great question. So So what's cool about the Cully TIF district is, and what's interesting too, if you look at the TIF districts and what's happening in East Portland, this isn't kind of TIF as usual. This isn't kind of how we've seen the history of urban renewal. This really was a coalition of community partners in Cully, NEA, Hacienda, others, Habitat for Humanity, that came to us and said, we have had experience with this tool over the past decade with the Neighborhood Prosperity Network districts, which are micro TIF districts. And we want to explore this as a larger tool for community stabilization. So in terms of 1 year, there's not a lot yet, because the way that tax increment finance works is that you freeze the area and the tax base, and you see increments start happening over time. So as of right now, when the district got created last year, it doesn't actually start creating funds or ramping up until the 5th year. So what the community is focused on now is the TIF plan was approved by council, and then that committee that just got approved by council, I believe it was 2 days ago, they approved the Cully committee. It's an oversight committee that's focused on both economic development and housing, made up of local residents in Cully. They are now tasked with putting together an action plan, and that action plan runs for 5 years. So obviously the first action plan is pretty modest because there's not a lot of increment in the bank to actually do work with. And over time, it's 20 to 30 years of the TIF district. That's when you start seeing the millions and the hundreds of millions happen that could go towards larger projects and stabilization.
Great, thank you, Shay. And I see, Christina, thank you, put in the chat link to the committee of those of you online. Corky, and I see one hand up, and then I think we might draw this to a close. And if there's a lot of interest, we might think about bringing you back, Shay, in the future. But let's go ahead and keep moving. Go ahead, Corky.
Sure. I've got a general question on the focus on middle wage jobs, primarily for BIPOC populations. So the equitable wealth question, and specifically what some specific examples of my concerns are, you mentioned equitable wealth creation is focused on small businesses, and I'm just wondering, did Prosper Portland say that's where we can get the most bang for our buck? I'm worried a little bit that focusing on small businesses, particularly small retail, new retail entrepreneurs, that sort of thing, can take a lot of funding from Prosper Portland, but then the actual wealth creation, equitable wealth creation, might be kind of small really there, because and the number of employees is fairly small. Another example would be the focus on downtown, which is needed, of course, absolutely. But downtown jobs lack the middle wage job, a lot of low wage, a lot of high wage jobs compared to industrial, for example. So, and another example would be the new TIF districts, which again, all look great. You throw up the map and they're like, yeah, that's needed, that's needed, that's needed. Wonderful. But I'm wondering how Prosper Portland approached, did you look at data that said, boy, this is where we get the most wealth creation for the best equitable wealth creation for the amount of dollars that we're spending on it?
Yeah, Corky, it's a great question. I think we're basing this along a lot of the data that we did with Echo Northwest, and certainly that Echo Northwest continues to work on as part of the governor's task force. So in terms of place-based thinking, yes, we're looking at those corridors, both from a residential and from a job creation standpoint, that have been most impacted and require the most support coming out of the pandemic. I think, yes, there's historically been an outsized focus on micro enterprise development. I think when we're thinking about equitable wealth creation, we're looking at scaling. I think that's our big focus, and specifically looking at those sectors, like I mentioned, the clusters. If we might have been supporting lots of those small food businesses, we're looking to target through the food and beverage manufacturing work, we're looking to target those that can scale, right? So I think it's a bit of a mind shift in terms of, yes, we want to continue to do work in terms of racial equity and supporting diverse founders, women founders, et cetera. But we are looking for those opportunities where we're seeing that growth of jobs, and we track that based on kind of the job creation of each firm that we're supporting. Similarly, I will just share transparently, a lot of the work of our traded sector team, which usually is doing a lot more, they're doing a lot more traveling to trade shows, they're taking businesses, they're taking folks to go kind of grow their accounts and sales, et cetera. A lot of them are focused on retention right now. And I think that's a reality we all need to be transparent and clear-eyed about, is that a lot of firms are in the process of considering leaving the city or looking at leaving the city or actively leaving the city. So I'd say, unfortunately, a lot of our time is spent on that. And I think that's an important, play from a wealth creation, just in terms of the income that the city stands to lose. But I think we're trying to have a healthy mix, Corky, of both supporting founders, but then also who are folks that are coming up in the traded sector that could use more of those scale-up supports.
Thank you, Shay. And last question from Heather. Thank you for being patient, Heather.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I put my question in the chat, and some of this might speak to my not understanding this process completely, but and it might speak to the larger process that we're talking about in general as I read it out. So I'm wondering if the TIF investments are solely based on the economic development with no thought put into the environmental impact or the impact of business growth within the communities that you're talking about and the people who live within those communities, because that area in particular and some of those neighborhoods you talked about are in the most industrialized watershed, which I represent in the state, and those people are affected disproportionately health-wise by the continued growth of industry in that watershed in general. So just curious about that as we have this conversation as a committee, but also what you're speaking about, particularly to the TIF investments.
Thanks, Heather. It's a great question. I think it aligns closely with what Cassie also put in the chat around kind of what are the impacts of TIF historically, and what are both the displacement and environmental factors that can occur. I think I want to point to some of the lessons learned that we've had from our Northeast work in the TIF district there, as well as the Cully. I think some of the reasons you have communities of color interested in TIF in East Portland for the first time is because they're seeing what happened in Cully. And trying to answer both questions here, what's different about Cully in the TIF district is from its very inception, right? From the very plan that creates the way we can do these investments, that sets the stage for all the oversight, that sets the stage for the investments. It's fundamentally different in that certain activities are disallowed, not just disencouraged, but disallowed. So I'll give you an example. In the Cully plan, we are not allowed to make investments that would create displacement pressure without having the kind of requisite community stabilization that happens at the same time. So, for example, we cannot fund sidewalks in Cully, just period, unless that parcel is tied to a stabilization resource, whether it's affordable housing or a community center, et cetera. So where you had in previous generations across Portland, TIF funded things like the Yellow Line first, right, in North Portland, and created immense displacement pressure. So we're, again, hoping that this is more of a community-led model than it's been in the past, taking those lessons learned from the Northeast Committee, and then as well Cully, which is newer, but promising in terms of community's interest and their oversight of the work.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Shay.
I'm sorry, can I ask one more
Very
question?
quick, because we are way over.
Hi, Shay, it's John Isaacs with the Chamber. In the Advanced Portland Plan in Outcome 4.3, it's where it makes the most direct statement about industrial land, and it's 4.3.3 industrial land strategy. And it says very clearly ensure adequate industrial land supply, including for manufacturing, and address site readiness, address encroachment challenges in industrial centers. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate Prosper's perspective on that, just where we are with industrial land.
Yeah, I think there's a few different conversation threads, right? So that's not one we're tackling immediately, but I think it's an important connection. It's one of the reasons we're here. It's one of the reasons we're eager to see what comes out of the EOA. I think we're also eager to see what happens at Metro for conversations around the urban growth boundary. I think we're looking to make sure that resources go towards making the best use of the land that we currently have in Portland. Although we do acknowledge there's a shortage and there's a lot of the sites that require more cleanup. I think I'm preaching to the choir in this room around that, certainly. But I think there's more to come on that, John. I think we're looking to work in concert with Metro and with Tom and his team around how do we prioritize those investments. And I think it's also certainly why we're looking to include, in terms of when we think about potential TIF, making sure that some of those areas like the northern side of Columbia Corridor and Park Rose are also considered.
Great. Thank you again. Really appreciate you being here, and hope to see you again. Steve, I'm going to pivot to you to talk about forecast, and we'll magically make up time here.
Tom, can you bring up the slide deck? Thank you. I would like to summarize a lot of technical information. Both Sam and I will be summarizing a lot of technical information in the forecast and the buildable land inventory. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly in the summary and then have half of the time for discussion. Show it here. This slide shows summary of the presentation on the forecast and some of the key takeaways. Go back to the previous one first. And some of the core takeaways from each of those. What is the EOA forecast? It's generally a job growth forecast across 20 sectors going to 2045. It's a new construction projections by building type, and it's a land demand forecast by 11 different geographies. What we studied that went into the forecast, we did a growth and market trends report last year that was largely the basis of much of the work done. Eco Northwest prepared a marine industrial land forecast that was also part of this. We reviewed recent forecasts at the national and state and regional level. We updated all the model inputs. So there's a lot of background that went into this. How did we model the projections? I'll go through the methodology a little bit, but generally starting with jobs, from that projecting building space demand and then land demand. We'll talk about what are the baseline results. The baseline or mid-range forecast is essentially for 110,000 new jobs. And then what were the other forecast scenarios analyzed? We also looked at 3 other scenarios for low growth, high growth, and one in between for 40% middle wage growth. And Tom, if you could shift to the next one. So what is in the EOA forecast? At the last meeting, I talked about the EOA looking at the growing economy from a land use lens, and it's largely in this map. The 11 different colors on this map are different business district types that represent segments of employment land demand. And so we will look at forecast for job growth and land demand in each of those colors on the map, as well as the buildable land inventory capacity to meet that forecast. As an example, the harbor and airport districts is a dark gray area on the map. And this is an overview of what the result of the forecast is for about 18,000 new jobs, about 11 million square feet of new building demand, and 849 acres of land demand. Next slide. So I'll talk about forecast of what we studied. Keep going, that one. We also looked at recent forecasts at the national level, state level, and regional level, and compared that with what we found in the market trends analysis. The green shading shows the Oregon Employment Department's regional forecast to 2030, and that was the forecast that was actually used in the baseline forecast. And some of the takeaways from this comparison is in each of these forecasts, we're expecting to continue to see faster growth in the region than we're seeing at the state level or the national level, consistent with the trends. Another is that we're seeing some structural shifts in growth. We're seeing much slower growth in leisure and hospitality, or what we call consumer services, coming out of the pandemic, and we're seeing a little faster growth in the industrial sectors. And then that kind of pink or tan bar at the bottom, we're seeing much lower overall growth levels, about 60% of the trend in each of these jurisdictions. So the forecasts are looking at much smaller growth than what we're used to seeing in the last business cycle. Next one. Market factors that affected these. So it's a little bit more detail about what went into these forecasts. COVID, or the pandemic, and the recession were a big part of this. Generally, the EOA looks at long-term growth trends. So we look at between now and 2030 and to 2045, and not as much on the fluctuations in the middle. However, there are a lot of unusual aspects of the COVID-19 recession and recovery from that. And much of Shay's work is explained as solving those problems. One of those issues is slower growth in Multnomah County that we haven't recovered as fast as the nation. And it's been particularly in the corridors and the central city, in leisure and hospitality, and also the education sector. Another challenge is we jumped to about 9% inflation in 2022. So there's been Federal Reserve pressure to raise interest rates and constrain growth of the economy. And then hybrid office space is another complexity. We've actually recovered our office sector jobs, more than recovered, in Multnomah County and in the region. However, about half of those office workers are still working from home. And so there are big issues for vacant office space, and particularly in the central city. Slower growth in the labor market is a big driver in the lower forecast. Partly this is a long-term trend in lower birth rates, but also the large baby boomer generation is retiring in this decade. They will all be 65 by 2030, and so that's having a big impact on the labor market as well. We're seeing a much tighter labor market to support job growth. Accelerating industrial sector growth, there are a variety of factors that go into that. One of the bigger ones is moderated job losses during the recession. In the previous 3 recessions in the region, the industrial sectors were the biggest source of job losses, and that was much less this time. Instead, the major job losses were more in neighborhood commercial demand and in the institutional sectors. Growth of e-commerce through the recession, a lot of supply chain disruptions. International supply chain disruptions during the pandemic were a big driver on expanding regional warehouse space in the supply chain. So we've seen fairly diverse growth in warehouse and distribution space. And there's a manufacturing uptick. Not so much in jobs, as Shay's talked about in Portland and Multnomah County, yet we've still had some high displacement, and we haven't recovered from that, but we're seeing a lot of investment in new construction for manufacturing, and we're seeing a big uptick in growth in semiconductor manufacturing as well. Plus federal incentives that for the first time have incentivized manufacturing growth, particularly in semiconductor manufacturing and clean energy. Another factor, instability. We will continue to see instability in the forecast with generally generated by recession and or at least in the next 10 years, risk of a second recession, but it's looking better, slower inflation rate this time, and most economists talking about a softer landing. Tom, I'll shift to the next one. How we modeled assumptions in the forecast is largely set up in the goal 9 rule and specific requirements. One is that we have a 20-year forecast horizon. We started with 2019 because it's a peak year in the business cycle, and then we projected on to 2045 because that's also a full employment assumption. So it takes us from peak to peak as a straight line long-term projection. We're required to do a short-term forecast, which we picked to 2030 for development-ready sites. We are required to look at, for inputs in the forecast, growth trends and market trends are the primary basis of the forecast. We're called to look at national, regional, and local trends, to look at the comparative advantages of the city relative to the region, particularly by sector. And for required to look at a forecast for jobs and a forecast for land demand. And it's for industrial and other employment land types, and also look at site size and short-term forecast. And the Goal 9 rule also sets up some strong encouragement clauses for looking at regional coordination. So we start with a regional forecast and look at Portland's share of that regional forecast. for visioning for community economic objectives. So the policy direction that went into the comprehensive plan on the economy was a driver of the last EOA, and we're looking at that again this time. And then there are various policies to address brownfields, prime industrial, and special siting characteristics, etc. This is a kind of an overcomplicated summary of the model assumptions that went into the demand forecast. Essentially, we use the same demand model that we used last time with a few refinements that I'll talk about in the next slide. We start with a regional forecast. Again, we're using OED's forecast for the region, and it comes to an average annual growth rate of 0.82%. The next point down is we work from that to a city forecast that's based on the city share of regional growth and projections at a 46% capture rate. If we look back for the last 20 years, we've generally had about a 46% capture rate, so we're projecting continuation of that. And the forecast goes from jobs by sector to jobs by building type based on recent data and trends across Portland. We project demand for new construction based on square foot per jobs assumption that were updated based on the last business cycle, new construction in the last business cycle. For area ratio assumptions for land need that go along with new construction. Next slide. So looking at results, what is in the baseline forecast? The baseline forecast estimates 110,000 new jobs in the city between 2019 and 2045, generally 37 million square feet, again, new construction, 1,800 acres of demand, and it's shown here across the 4 aggregate geographies that are on the map. One of the takeaways here is we're seeing a larger share of industrial sector jobs. 36,000 new jobs are in the industrial sector. That's more of a dominant share. It reflects partly the faster projections from OED in the industrial sectors that are based on regional trends. That the city of Portland's dominant share in the faster growing sector of transportation and warehousing. We're seeing slower growth in the institutional areas, and that's partly because of substantially lower education projections than we've seen in the last 2 business cycles, 3 business cycles really. And then also we based the forecast this time specifically on hospitals rather than the larger healthcare sector, and we've had slower growth and slower projections for the hospital sector. And then one last thing, takeaway, residential is a big portion of this. 18,000 new jobs in the residential areas that the EOA isn't really addressing. About half of those, a little bit more than half, are in institutional sectors, and it's schools and a lot of nursing homes and care facilities that are healthcare institutions, and then about 40% are in home occupations. We also applied.
Sorry, Steve, could you go back to that last slide for just a second? Oh, for the residential, when you're particularly, I'm thinking of care workers, are you talking about?
Residential areas.
Yes. You're talking about our capacity or our need?
No, this is just job growth. Okay. We're not looking at building demand for new housing or those facilities or acres in the EOA.
Okay.
The housing needs analysis is looking at expanding the residential areas. So this is just looking at a significant part of the job growth will still be in those residential areas that is not employment.
I have a question about this slide too, Steve. On the total acres,
yeah,
is that total that will be needed in totality or additional to what we have now?
No, it's in addition. It's the
Okay.
2019 to 2045 increment. So it's over the next 26 years.
So over the next 26 years, we will need 1,511 total additional acre.
Demand.
Okay.
What the demand
Or
is saying, yes.
Total what we have now.
20 million square feet of building in the
Yeah.
industrial area.
Okay.
New building.
Thank you.
Bob, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the section prior to this one, I'm just curious. One of the things that Goal 9 requires, section A5, is as a major determinant of your forecast, carrying capacity of the air, land, and water resources of the planning area need to be considered and evaluated. And I've never seen that done in the Goal 5 analysis, actually, the Goal 9 analysis. It gets kind of left out. But it seems somewhat fundamental. It seems like it should be up here with these kinds of results as well. What is the carrying capacity?
We'll hear a lot about that in the next presentation that Sam will go through. It's reflected in the buildable land inventory, and we compare the forecast to the buildable land inventory, and the buildable land inventory includes a lot of environmental protections and essentially carrying capacity for what we expect to develop. So that's where it's brought together. The two supply and demand portions are brought together.
This is just the.
No, I understand that, but I think it has a place on both sides of the equation is my point. But I also don't think we actually do a carrying capacity analysis. I think we do a balancing process, but that's different than carrying capacity. That's different because what we have here are very hard targets that we must produce, whatever total 1,825 acres. Hard, solid target. But when we get to the carrying capacity side of the equation for the environment, we're not going to say that we need to meet this to get to this. And I just want to frame the environment that gives, it's not the economics.
It's a good point. I just add the Goal 9 rule is actually, or the Goal 9 statement that you read from is actually interpreted in the Goal 9 rule, and it sets specific requirements for the economic opportunities analysis, and we have to legally follow those. And so it actually implements how that carrying capacity is addressed in the process for this. So I understand the point. We're also particularly focusing on the Goal 9 rule requirements, administrative statute.
Also just say really quickly, Patricia Diefenderfer, that in the next, when we look at the buildable lands inventory, the analysis is going to show the methodology for how constraints on sites are factored in, and constraint, environmental, for example, is considered a constraint from the perspective of utilization for other uses on the industrial land. So I think you'll see the both sides.
Great, thank you.
And I just have 2 or 3 more slides.
Great.
One on middle wage jobs. With an equity focus, we worked with Oregon Employment Department to do specific projections on jobs in middle wage occupations that don't require bachelor's degrees. They do forecasts not only on employment sectors, but also on occupations and by education. So they were able to do that analysis for us. Looking at this slide, it's a table of the projected middle wage job growth within the baseline forecast by sector. Essentially, 39,000 new middle wage jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree are part of that 110,000 new jobs in the baseline forecast. Comes to 36% of the overall growth rate. This is the good news from this is much better, bigger, a lot more volume of middle wage job growth than we've seen in the past. Looking at the columns, the first column is on total job growth. The second column with the yellow shading, 36%. This shows the share of each of these sectors that is middle wage jobs. These sectors are the core sectors where we're seeing middle wage job growth. And altogether, they add up to almost 90% of the middle wage job growth that we're projecting OED is projecting in the region and in the city of Portland. And then the third column is the share of the middle wage job growth within each of these sectors. So the big takeaway here is that not only these core sectors driving it, but 3/4 of the projected middle wage job growth is in two sectors. In transportation and warehousing accounts for 48% of it, and 23% is in healthcare. And it's partly we're seeing a lot more growth in those two sectors, healthcare and an aging community, et cetera, and partly and a strong growth in warehouse and distribution. But also they're particularly concentrated in the city of Portland. Look at the last column in the slide. This shows the city of Portland share of the Tri-County area. So that weaves into the forecast, and it shows our opportunity for expanded middle wage job growth in these areas. When we looked at two slides on the forecast scenarios, in addition to the baseline forecast, we looked at 3 other scenarios that are options that we could look at in this process. A low scenario is essentially based on Metro's allocation, minimum allocation to meet regional growth management goals to 101,000 new jobs. Baseline forecast is what I just described. An additional one that is 40% middle wage job growth, and that number is driven by 2 things. One, on the state's 40-40-20 goal for higher education. Essentially, growth capacity for higher education has to include 40% middle wage, middle skill education levels. And so it applies that similar growth, not just based on trends, but on expecting to grow across the income distribution. And then also 39% is the current share. So going to 40% will not increase income inequality as a result of the job growth that we're seeing. And then a high forecast that comes to 126,000 new jobs. And it essentially matches you'll see it in the next slide, it matches the growth rate of the last 2 business cycles. So this is the last slide that looks at a depiction of the forecast and the high, medium, and low scenario. The black line on this is the trend in the city of Portland, job growth trend. Projecting it forward, the green, blue, and yellow line are the high baseline and low forecasts. The dotted line is the trend in the last business cycle. So what we're seeing in the projections are substantially less than you're used to seeing in the last 10 years in Portland. You're seeing a lot more. You will see substantially lower growth if the projections hold out.
Steve, if I can, substantially lower growth in overall jobs, but an increased percentage of middle wage jobs.
An increased share of middle wage jobs and an increased amount.
All right, thank you.
That's your last slide, yes.
That's my last slide. So the discussion.
Yeah, so maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so. And for those of you online, it would be really helpful if you raised your virtual hand. I don't have the ability to see the full spectrum of who's there and chatting. And then those of you in the room, any questions for Steve about the forecast itself? And then also, even if you don't have questions about it, does it kind of make sense? Is it clear? Do you understand how they arrived at it? Yes, John.
So Steve, thank you for, I want to understand how you bake in or how you see what's happening right now. We lost 2.5% of our population in the last 2 years, and Shay said prospers in a competition mindset, right? That we can't just. Why you're saying you're projecting slower growth than what you have in the past, but I'm just wondering how you baked in that we're actually shrinking right now as a city, growing, even though you project growth. I'm just curious how that's.
Yes, excellent question. Actually, the national and state and regional forecasts are all about only 60% of what they were in the last business cycle. So it's not just the pandemic. Nationally, we've come out of the pandemic with positive job growth. We haven't seen that yet in Multnomah County. And so there are issues there. Much of the Advanced Portland work is aimed at addressing those fundamentals that Shay talked about to support coming out of the recession and increasing that growth. The EOA is more looking at what is the overall growth projection to 2030 for calculating land demand and to 2045 for calculating land demand. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little.
I think it's just too, and this is sort of the division of labor between our work, the EOA, and Prosper Portland is, they're looking at the next 5 years and how do we get out of the pandemic and the recession recovery. And we're looking out 20 to 25 years, like where are we going? And so we are still a bit more optimistic about.
Oh, I like to see the optimism.
The long range growth, continued long range growth of Portland. So it would take a number of down years before that further bends that growth curve.
Yeah, one thing we always point out is that we are still growing amongst younger age demographics, right? Like even though we have an overall shrinkage, the younger people are still, that age demographic is still growing. And then the other thing I'll just point out, I'll move on to study last year showed that the reason downtown is struggling so much here is we had the third most dependent downtown in the country on office jobs. And so you pointed out the shift to work at home, or we're still dealing with that because we were overly dependent on those types of jobs in the central city versus others. So anyway, thank you. That's it.
I think the other important thing to note is that Steve's been talking about jobs, and we're going to get into sort of what that means for land demand, square footage, and in some way there's a mismatch, right, between, especially when it comes to things like manufacturing. There's a lot of demand for manufacturing space and land. That doesn't necessarily correlate to strong manufacturing job growth.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So we'll get to that and sort of reconcile those two things when it comes to, what's actually like on the ground and available for development.
Yeah.
Corky and then Bob, but go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, I'm still trying to think.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Maybe Sam has indicated that you're going to get to the answers to some of my questions in the next round here. But, I guess I'm struck when I was reading through it in your presentation. It does feel like we're following of analysis that we've done in the past. Different inputs, but sort of the same structure. And I think that will end up in a very similar place to where we've ended up in the past at the end of the day, even with different inputs. And then I think it's the sort of what John was just alluding to. We want to project optimism. So even where the reality is not matched to the hopes, we're going to project optimism. I get that on the economic side. On the environmental side, what that tends to mean is the more optimistic we are on the jobs, the more acres we need, the less we can protect the environment. So matching those up is really important. Things. One, some of the assumptions that we're putting into the job growth really need more detail, including things like automation, whether land converts to jobs, whether business space converts to jobs. They don't, and I think we've been over-dependent, although we're getting better on this idea that acres equals jobs. It doesn't necessarily. Then additionally, I think, I'd like to understand better, because I didn't see it in any of the documents we got, and I'm not hearing in this report either. Something has shifted on the industrial land. I mean, the Port of Portland has gone from saying we should have picked the most aggressive projections in the last round to saying they made a mistake and it should have been the low forecast. And that, whereas they have set up until 3 years ago, they needed a lot more land. They're now saying and that they can't fill that land right And so I don't see those kinds of things popping out here yet, and maybe they're coming, but those are sort of seismic shifts in my mind that ought to be, we need to dig down on deep, because I think it's easy to skip over them and kind of just wind up in kind of the same space that we've always wound up in. That was our question there.
Were they questions or?
Well, it's a question as to how do we get to those things?
You're good. On automation, that's a good one. We use the regional forecast, and they don't specifically look at automation, but automation is a big factor in the national forecast. It's much more complex. They look at international growth, they look at consumer demand, they look at population growth. They also look at effects of automation. They're estimating about automation impacts would be particularly in 3 occupations, a 4% decline in office support. It's been a long-term trend. Admin workers, 2% decline in manufacturing from automation, and a 1% decline in retail. You're seeing a lot more of that now, fewer workers in retail. Those are the sectors where we'll be having a net automation loss. And then the regional and state forecasts consider those. They just bring that into their consideration. They focus more on the job trends within the different geographies. And then the port shift. I have a slide specifically on warehouse and distribution. I didn't put it in at the end, but it's really accelerated in the last 10 years. The warehouse and distribution job growth in the region, it's been a slow growth, and then it's just really taken off in the last 10 years. And so that is reflected in the current forecast that the port is implementing. They're primarily addressing marine terminal demand within that, but they're part of the larger transportation warehousing sector.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll keep talking about these things as we work through policy options and really figure out how to fill this gap or meet the gap. Corky.
Yeah, my question I was going to ask is actually touches on Bob's point too, but I'm going to disagree with you, Bob. You said more growth leads to the need for more acreage, which argue, maybe incorrectly, that more growth leads to more acreage, but it also leads to more wealth creation, which then can be funneled back into environmental protection. And even though it's not the same thing what you're talking about, I'll just refer to the PSEF fund as a good example. If you didn't have good growth at the time that was created, it would never have been created. So there's the potential, we may not succeed at it, but there's a potential when you have a strong economy for that to be funneled back into environmental protection. And so I say that because that leads me to my question that I was coming up with, and Sam, tell me if you're going to be touching on this already, which is Shay started off saying growth is stagnating. It was pointed out that we're losing population, we're losing businesses, but at the same time, we're still growing, right, Steve? I mean, we still see a relatively healthy growth projected for the future. My question is, we know that we're losing some, and we know we're gaining some. Has anything been studied about what specifically we're losing and what specifically we're gaining? So middle wage jobs is one of them, and Steve's data shows that we're actually seeing a higher percentage of middle wage jobs projected in the future. So that's the good news, even though perhaps we're not growing as much as we have been, our middle wage job growth jumps up. So that's good. But there are other qualitative factors that I think we should be looking at. And I'm wondering, have those been looked at, and can they be looked at? Or am I way off base and this is just a dumb comment?
No, that's very helpful. I do have a slide at the end on recovery so far from the pandemic, and it essentially shows that Multnomah County hasn't recovered as much as the other 2 counties in the Tri-County area, and where we have not recovered is mainly in 2 sectors, leisure and hospitality, that were the biggest job losses that we had. So restaurants and hotels primarily, and in the education sector. Those 2 account for over 3/4 of our gap where we haven't recovered our jobs compared to the nation and the rest of the region. We've also had slower recovery of manufacturing jobs, and we've some of what Shay has talked about And retail, we've actually seen decline in Portland relative to the rest of the region in retail. So we have looked at that. It's not really addressed in the forecast because we're mainly looking at the projections. It's just trying to understand what's going on. And we will continue to look at that in the next few months and may make adjustments to the forecast, even with an updated new OED forecast, Oregon Employment Department forecast. And it will take into account our short-term recovery.
Thank you. We're right at 11:15. Jeff, thank you in the chat. I'm sorry for those of you online if you're having some audio problems. We'll continue to work toward speaking up so that everyone can hear. And I don't even know where the microphone is. Does anyone know? All right, so maybe it's a matter of pointing toward the screen as we're talking. But I do want to give us just 2 minutes, and especially for those of you who we've not heard anything from, if you have any additional thoughts about sort of the forecast, and does it sort of seem, I've heard some healthy skepticism, some different ideas about what the future, I mean, it's all projecting, but trying to sort of wrestle with where we're at now and where we're going to be. Are we being too rosy, not rosy enough? And then, are these sort of consistent with your view of economic opportunity in the city of Portland? Does it kind of add up? Do you have enough to even speculate on that? Anyone care to weigh in? Yes.
I have a question actually for Corky. Corky, when you were just talking about, where we're growing, where we're losing, and then you talked about some other qualitative factors. Like what kinds of things were you talking about when you were talking about qualitative factors?
Well, that's a really good question, and even if I had an answer for you, I might hesitate to say it because we start to get very subjective at that point.
Yeah.
So what popped in my mind is Steve mentioned the different types of jobs, the loss of retail, for example, and what I'm thinking is that a bad thing? I mean, at first blush, yeah, that's a bad thing, but then again, those are relatively low wage jobs. So, is it a bad thing for our city? That's kind of and it gets really subjective, so it's really hard to do. But it's also related to Bob's question in that, if using these trends, do we see a path using the current trends to put more into environmental protection, or does it go the other way? If, for example, we were becoming much poorer, if trend was dropping down, I can guarantee you we'd not be doing as much protection as we do now. So very subjective. Does that kind of get what you?
Yeah, it totally does. And that's why I asked the question. I just wanted to probe a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things that we will talk about when we get into. So right now we're trying to set foundation and understanding and a base of knowledge and data and information. And then it's like, what do we do with all of this, right? And that's where you start to think about, okay, what programs, what actions are you going to take? Because
I was jumping to that. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying. So if we think retail is not as important as something else, but retail may still have some importance. What do we do to, help that, support that, or the industrial question? What kinds of jobs? I think digging deeper into what kinds of industrial jobs is important, and there's space considerations and how that squares with the space the land availability that we have as well. And because the projections are based on, and this is where I'll ask Steve to correct me if I'm wrong, but projections are based on trends, and that's important and that's good. But trends also, it's a question of do we want those trends to continue, right? What trends do we want to continue and what trends don't we? And what do we do to help shape those curves? That's the action. Those are the actions that we take that shape those curves, because trends can be good or trends can be bad, right? So I just wanted to kind of explore that question a little bit more.
Yeah, that's basically where I was trying to go with it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I saw there was a question from Cassie in the chat. We'll come back to that in just a second. Benton, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. The last part of this conversation is super interesting to me, and it just, I guess it's begging a question of I think, Bob, I'm hearing what you're saying about if we go down the same same process we've gone down in the past. We'll probably come out with the same outcome. What we generally think similarly. But I guess what I'm struggling with in the last 3 or 4 commenters is this our job to have a conversation about what jobs we want to have in Portland, or is our job to simply do an analysis about what we think is going to happen? But we are not policymakers. We're not elected officials. We're not the people who get to pick and choose which industries succeed in Portland, right? And I think, Corky, your point about retail jobs really jumped out at me, because maybe a decline in retail jobs is a good thing from a we would rather have higher wage job standpoints, but a decline in retail jobs also typically means your overall economy is declining, right? And so are we really trying to be in a place where we're picking winners and losers in our economy, or should we be actually just focused on what the data is telling us so that we can make decisions based on what we currently expect to happen? Like, whose role is that, and is it ours? So I guess I'm asking of the group more than even the leadership.
And to be clear, my question was, do we have that data? Has that been looked at from a data perspective?
Yeah, I think those are both good questions, and sort of the role of this group and the role of BPS and the EOA is to build that case and to present those options to council, because city council is the ultimate decision maker on some of these different choices about how much, especially about sort of how much land capacity we're going to have. They certainly, are the ones that have adopted and directed the Advanced Portland strategy, where we make infrastructure investments, the amount of natural resource protection or floodplain protection. Ultimately, that's where this all gets out. Our job is to have that sort of information to make a well-informed decision, and that along the process, so you all understand what into it, and you can make informed testimony to the planning commission, and the planning commission can make an informed recommendation to council, and then ultimately it is up to council to make the policy calls.
I apologize to others who have more conversation on this. I'd like to stop it here for now, and move us along into the buildable lands conversation. Can we take like a 2-minute bio break, like really short, not even a full 5 minutes? Okay. Thank you. Apologies to those online I didn't get to. And Cassie, I see your question there. I'm hoping we will touch on that in the buildable lands inventory discussion, and if not, definitely in the reconciliation discussion at noon. So 2 minutes, please. Thank you all.
In a constrained environment.
Tom, Steve, can I ask, did folks get, because I'm the newbie here, did folks get these materials beforehand? Okay.
And I think that's where, that's where we're gonna.
Okay.
Because I'm like,
Yeah.
I have questions. I have now.
Oh, I'm sorry,
I've done
I
it
missed
twice.
Oh, Steph, I'm so sorry. My
I can appreciate if I'm having to absorb, but
Yeah, my apologies.
And so it really is about, I think that's why I've always said other environments.
Giving people hands.
So we started Wednesday. So, yeah.
That's why.
Image in the main room is frozen. Has that been resolved?
I don't know.
It's moving for Daniel.
Where we started with that one.
Oh, somebody has their hand up. Maybe he's, okay, thank you. Marie, are we doing okay? Can you give us a thumbs up or verbal? Okay, great, excellent. Thank you all. Wonderful. So we're gonna, Sam is gonna walk us through buildable lands inventory, explain what that means and what that looks like. And then we'll spend the last half hour today, half hour-ish, focused on sort of bringing together the employment forecast that Steve talked about, the work that Sam's gonna tell us about. So go ahead, Sam. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the buildable land inventory, which is the supply side of this whole analysis, as we've been talking about, and then we're going to bring it back to supply and demand pieces. In simplest terms, the buildable land inventory is the current development capacity of the land. That's the current development. Of physical constraints as well as market conditions. I'll get into how we kind of incorporate some of those things. So I'm going to walk you through the methodology a little bit, and it's in the most simplistic terms. There are 6 key steps to this analysis. We take into account all the vacant land that we've got in the city for industrial uses. We look at redevelopable land, which is identified primarily through a feasibility lens.
Sam, could you speak up just a little bit? I think they might be having a hard time hearing you.
Okay.
Please, or talk that way. Sorry.
Then we look at gross capacity based on market development trends. We look at what we call development constraints, but it's really about developing employment lands, and whether that's, environmental, physical or regulatory constraints. Those are all incorporated. And then we populate the model with permit data from the last few years as actual capacity. Steve mentioned that we're using for a base year of 2019, which follows the last cycle. So our BLI is 2023 data. So it sort of necessitates a slightly backward, to incorporate that capacity, which then feeds into the forecast. And then we get our net new. Just from the off, there are a number of properties that we exclude from the analysis, that we exclude from consideration in the buildable land inventory. So that includes publicly owned lots. No, it does not Portland, Home Forward, or Prosper Portland. So those are incorporated. We exclude utility company owned lots, railroad property, green spaces like parks, natural areas and cemeteries, airport property, so any property within the PDX security fence, and then some other properties as well. We do kind of go back. We go back and that we know. So, for example, utility companies, there may be some property there, owned by utility company. So these that necessitates incorporate those two. The first step, identifying vacant land. This is Appendix 6, page 39 of the EOA report. This is a map that dates back to 2021. It was put together by staff at the time of vacant land based on, I believe, aerial photographs, or aerial. And simply speaking, we take this, where we take this base layer and we just subtract anything that's been redeveloped since, or developed since. Elsewhere, outside of the three industrial geographies you see denoted in gray, we take a slightly different. One is using the assessor database. If it's vacant land, it's initially incorporated, and then we use a building coverage ratio percent of the lot area. So small lot areas that are covered by a very small building, still incorporated as vacant. We get a little bit more complex in our methodology as we move towards redevelopment land. We apply a development feasibility lens to redevelopment land. It's a slightly different approach again for the industrial zones compared to the commercial and mixed use zones. In the industrial zones, we're ignoring any site that is less than 3 acres, and that's the total site, not just the tax lot. And that's examples of redevelopment activity over the past 5 or 10 years, and sort of looking at it from a demand perspective. There's no site size restriction in the central city industrial or dispersed employment geographies, so that's central city industrial zones, simply because those we've seen smaller properties redeveloping in those zones. Critically, we're just looking at it with a strike price in mind, and that strike price is $15 per square foot. Any already developed lot that is, or developed site that is valued less than $15 a square foot, we're saying is incorporated into that redevelopment. It's cheap enough to redevelop.
Question, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you dig down deeper on two of these things. One is the site size less 3+ acres. I mean, that seems like a lot actually if we're talking about jobs. That's not a small, pretty huge parcel. And the second one is 50% tax lot. 50% of the tax lot must be underutilized or vacant. I mean, if you get a really big tax lot, you could have a significant portion of land that's utilized, but still be below that 50% threshold. So that to me doesn't make sense either. So I was wondering if you just talk to those things.
Yeah, of course. So the initially on the site size piece, that is sites that are in excess of 10 acres. We started to see, as those kind of larger redevelopment sites are redeveloped and improved, we're starting to see a slight reduction in the overall size, but it's still nowhere near 3 acres. So 3 acres is actually more of a conservative. 3 acres is more of a conservative approach that is looking forwards and trying to where those larger sites are kind of taken off the books, so to speak. But to your point, I think by excluding anything less than 3 acres, like what is the sum total of those kind of that less than 3 acre range? And I think off the top of my head, you recall what that number was, Steve, but I believe total maybe a couple of 100 acres. That doesn't necessarily fit within what the criteria for redevelopment activity is, and what the market's done over the last cycle. Sense, right? So you might have a lot of low value tax lots that are less than 3 acres, or sites that are less than 3 acres, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to correspond to redevelopment. So we're trying to kind of right size that with like likely market conditions and activity.
Sam, they're still having a hard time hearing you, so I don't know how to reconcile that. We'll come back to that, or maybe we can get closer. But Corky, I saw your hand up, and Ellen, I see that you have a question.
A little bit on that. If you had multiple sites adjacent to each other, if you had 4 3-acre sites adjacent to each other that were all in the $15 strike price, then I would think, okay, that's got some potential. There may not be a single case where anywhere in your study, but I'm wondering if that was looked at.
That's the next slide.
So just quickly, an acre would be 2 downtown city blocks, correct?
One.
Well, if it's 200 by 200.
1 block per acre downtown.
Oh, yeah, okay, so 1 block, 1 city block.
For industrial, I mean, historically for industrial purposes, I mean, you all, there's people in the room who can speak more to that, but industrial land by its nature, I mean, industrial uses by their nature require a lot of land, and an acre for industrial land is pretty small.
Just the space to turn the truck around.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, that's the reality, and I think using the three acre is, Sam used the word conservative. I mean, I think that, I'm not sure which way we're using the word, but sometimes the word conservative is conservative on one side, but I think that it's optimistic to go down to 3 acres. And so I would say that we are being generous with that analysis.
We're not just talking about heavy industrial here, we're talking about maker spaces. I mean, think about the Central East Side where you have a tremendous number of jobs concentrated into very small spaces that are industrial.
And maybe we can look at that a little bit more and see, because it could be that there's some industrial land that fits that more traditional mold, and I don't know, Sam, maybe.
Well, one distinction there is that it may not have been caught, but it's only the areas in gray on this map, which are the industrial geographies where we're implementing that site size threshold. We're not talking about Central City industrial. We're not talking about Central East Side, because you're totally right. There's a lot more this type redevelopment, a lot smaller site area.
How about Giles Lake Sanctuary and the Northwest Industrial, north of Bond? Is that in there?
Yeah.
So this is more what we would think of as the more traditional industrial space. Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify a point that you made, our sites are shared ownership. So, we have an average, I think, of 5 tax lots per site in our sort of Columbia corridor and other industrial geographies. So when we talk about sites, we're talking about multiple tax lots under shared ownership. See that on, Tom's already brought it up.
Before you go though, can you get to the 50% piece too?
Oh, and the 50% piece.
Yeah, I mean, so if you have a site that's 100 acres and only 49% of it is redevelopable, that doesn't count. I mean, it seems like if you're gonna go with the 3, that's a cutoff. But cutting off based on percentage of a property without reference to the size of the property to me doesn't make any sense.
So I think that gets captured in 2. One is our previous vacant land analysis tried to capture some of those sites that had the larger vacant space, like you're talking about, that it might have one building, but they have room to grow. And so that's sort of what we call partially vacant, and that got included in the vacant land layer. This redevelopment analysis is trying to take that the next step further.
So vacant portions of sites are still going to be incorporated into the model, right? So, so even if a site is, 40% underutilized or vacant, if that vacant strip has been identified and especially on larger sites, that's going to be incorporated. We're not going to miss that piece.
There's a couple of questions in the chat from Cassie. One is about sort of the connection between those 3 acre minus sites and the relationship to BIPOC employment, BIPOC businesses. And then the second one, can you scroll down just a little bit, Tom? The second one, thank you. Oh, why is the vacancy rate not factoring in trees floodplain requirements, or is it?
We will get to that. Okay. That's part of our constraints analysis. This very early step is just to identify what could be potentially incorporated into that capacity.
Okay.
And so I'll get into that in a couple of slides.
Let's move on then. Thank you.
So I just wanted to ground this kind of process in an example here. And so here you have it's comprised of 7 slots. It's along Columbia in our.
Tim, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I apologize. Marie is saying that we're seeing the slide sorter view of your presentation, so I'm worried they're maybe not being able to see things clearly. Marie, are you still seeing that, or did that resolve? Oh,
sees it.
Oh, okay. Jeff is saying I see it fine.
Oh my God.
Okay. Okay, then go for it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I just wanted to highlight this because it's a redevelopment site for the most part, and we're implementing this site-based criteria of $15 a square foot, and 3+ acres. If we total the value of all of those tax lots within that site, we get to almost 18 million. It's 30. So on a per square foot basis, that's $13.45 per square foot of lot area. So it satisfies that criteria for development.
Where is this?
This is along Columbia.
Columbia Boulevard.
Whereabouts?
Opportunity development.
At our number, yeah.
I had that money.
And I'll come back to the site very shortly just to highlight how we operate, how we use this and incorporate our sort of development constraints or our development barriers.
One question on this one then. Is this the BES site where they're putting housing?
I don't think so.
When we use an example site, the idea is to maybe just not exactly.
No, I'm not asking for that reason. I'm asking because I think it is actually, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's one of the questions we raised about this is that BES is putting, or the city's putting temporary housing on industrial sites. Would you count that if it was covered in temporary housing? As available or not?
It's temporary, we would count it, right?
Good question.
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
We'll look into
It's a
that.
big
That's a
question
follow-up.
because they're
It is a
sucking
big
up the big
question.
sites.
There are a few.
Are you talking about Safe Rest Villages?
Stay Fresh Village, but no, not Stay Fresh
Or
Villages.
the-
Now the
jails.
back row villages, whatever they're calling them.
Oh, the big,
There's reason to think that those are not going to go away in the foreseeable future.
that's,
Good question. Keep going, Sam. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll get into the how we calculate capacity briefly. We calculate capacity on those vacant and slightly differently for industrial zones and mixed use and commercial zones. On the this gets a little small, sorry. On the industrial zones, we calculate capacity based on site acreage and floor area ratios for each geography, and that's based on development trends over the past business cycle. Slide, you'll see what those floor area ratios are. They vary greatly between different employment geographies. Again, this is based on trends over the last business cycle. So what we've seen development come in terms of overall density. In the commercial geographies in orange, it's roughly between 0.4 and slightly higher in the commercial areas. In industrial, it's 0.3, and employment, which is your inner east side area, it's a little higher. And then in the center, a lot higher. Central city commercial especially is 6.6, which reflects more of your sort of high-rise office we've seen. So we use on those buildable sites. And then in the mixed use and commercial zones, it's closely related to housing and how we calculate and how we kind of split out housing from employment. In those zoning capacity matrix, I'm not going to get into it too much. The kind of allowable FAR for each of those zones, utilization based on, again, it's all based on market trends. So the utilization of that FAR, it might be like 80% of 3 to 1. The commercial and the employment component of those lots. So sum total of those things, it's really the average, lot by lot basis, lot by lot in these kind of mixed use zones, and say what's the employment, square footage that we expect on this lot specifically. It's more like, when we aggregate those things up into sort of our other geographies, that's the expectation, that's the capacity. Okay, so constraints. Everybody wants to know about constraints. Barriers to development, otherwise known as constraints here. We will matrix of constraint rates, which is basically a discount rate that's applied to the gross capacity. We have discount rates or constraint rates for greenway, floodplain, brownfield, infrastructure and transportation, landmarks, everything else. That full matrix is Appendix 5 of my memo. And so when we apply this, for example, to this, we've got a range of different constraints on this site. We've got floodplains in the north. We've got brownfields, a brownfield constraint on part of the site. We have sewer, water, and transportation deficiencies. We've got a landslide hazard area, and so each one of those constraints correspond to a discount rate, their averages out over the entire site to about 0.4. So we're reducing the capacity by 60% based on the presence of those constraints. And how we determine those constraint rates, sites that were impacted by those constraints and not impacted, right? And then just seeing, how that development compares. So here we would say, okay, well, our total taxable acres is 30 acres, but when you apply all these constraints, what we're really saying is we have capacity for development. We have about 12 acres for capacity to development, for development. Okay. Methodology is over there, and so how that transpires on the capacity side, when we factor in all of those things, the vacant, the redevelopment sites, the constraints, presence of constraints and development to development, is we've got citywide, this is just base supply. This is just the vacant and just the vacant land, and then the land that satisfies that redevelopment criteria. So vacant land, we have 3,200. Local land, we've got about 2,500 acres for a total of 5,700. About 57% is vacant. That's sort of show there. And then in the industrial geographies specifically, about 2/3 of the vacant inventory is in those industrial geographies, but it's mostly constrained.
Can I ask a question about the constraints?
Yes.
This is a place I hope we really look closely at, because I look at the property you're looking at, and when I hear 60% of it is undevelopable, it strikes me as not credible. when you look at that. And when I hear that you're discounting sites with a greenway on it, 25-foot setback, you're discounting them by 50%. So you're saying 50% of that land is not developable. That's a 25-foot setback. It could be 100 acres. We're trying to take 50 acres off of it because of something that's not even as wide as this room. I think that's something we need to be looking a lot more closely, right? That rates massively affect the land. I mean, when you're talking about taking 50% off the value of a huge discount, and I mean, and it's been something that's been built in forever. This is what I was getting at earlier when I said I feel like some of these things they're just pre-cooked and we just keep going round on them. But I think we really need to dig down on some of that stuff. Is this site that you're just showing really 60% undevelopable? Is a site with a greenway on it 50% undevelopable? That doesn't make any sense, really.
Yeah, we better say something, Steve.
The constraint rates were based on development trends, specifically on comparing development in the last business cycle, how much development occurred on this particular site with this particular constraint versus how much development occurred on sites without those constraints, and the constraint rates were calculated based on that. They're better than we've had in the past, and it's
and I think the thing that I didn't necessarily make clear is the layering effect of multiple constraints. Most of these sites, it's not just one constraint that's impacting them. And what we're talking about is the added cost of development. So it's not necessarily that we're saying 60% site is not developable. What we're saying is we think it is reduced by about 60% because of the added cost of addressing all of these constraints. And so it's a way of kind of getting to that piece of it that rather than, and I agree, maybe it's slightly a messaging problem.
I don't think it's a messaging problem. I think it's a really substantial problem. Of course, I mean, what are you comparing, for example, river dependent uses? You're talking about along the river, so you're talking about industrial land along the river that has greenway. It all has greenway on it. And so what are you comparing that to? When you say that it's got 50% less likelihood of developing, or only 50% is going to be developed relative to other sites, you got to compare apples to apples. If we're comparing all sites with greenways to each other, is there a difference, or are we comparing sites with greenway to an industrial parcel that's inland that doesn't have those kind? I mean,
maybe I could suggest one thing is. Oh, sorry. Maybe a little bit. I mean, just a little bit because it's pretty deep into methodology, but also I think that there's something to this idea of the layers of constraints, right? And that at some point it's just a tipping point from a financial standpoint, because part of this analysis is both a physical constraint and also like a financial assessment of the likelihood of redevelopment, and it's based on information of where we have actually seen. Like there's a threshold, right? A site can only have so much kind of constraint before someone says, it's just not worth the while to do anything with it. And just to maybe in case this is helpful, we did on the residential side as well, right? So it's a similar analysis where we looked and we did an economic analysis and determined, whether sites would redevelop based on financial feasibility of redevelopment. And that does take a lot of things out of the mix. And it's equally dealt on both sides, the industrial and the residential. So in case that's helpful.
Daniel asked, I think it might factor into this layering piece, but sort of the greenway net, was that also that it was layered with other constraints, or do you know the reference, or do you know?
I think Daniel's asking a similar question that Bob is, and we'll dig a little deeper and bring it back.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
I'll come to you in a
when we
second.
get to the reconciliation. So, speaking of constraints, here you've got the level of constraint, discount rate across the city, and so I'll say like 69% of the lots that we've identified as either vacant or unutilized, redevelopable, at least one constraint. 44% are of those lots are more than 50% constrained when you add up all the different constraint rates of that layering effect. So geographies, central city, less impacted by constraints than industrial geographies based on kind of that assumption that those are sort of more prepared or more financially ready to address some of those things, more valuable in terms of just development. Industrial geographies, the industrial lands are much more constrained than the central city and commercial. I don't think that's a surprise. When you look at how the overall capacity shakes out in terms of the kind of constrained lands, the post constraint break on capacity, we have a concentration of capacity in central city, as well as on like those campuses. Commercial capacity is more scattered throughout the city, along corridors and in centers, and then industrial capacity is more concentrated, but in fewer sites. That little table, you can see that. You can see in that middle column what we're calling the adjusted acres, which is the constrained capacity. So we've got about 1,100 acres of land available. Central city, 316 acres, commercial, 931. That some of that acreage is obviously this is gross, so see that ratio on the right there as well. In industrial, we're not assuming it. The last slide is just a 3D map of that capacity, pretty sort of underlining the concentration, which is sort of dominated by the office sector.
All right, I know Corky has a question or a comment.
Yeah, well, a comment on the layering the constraints. I think that we've got perhaps a disconnect between what Steve is describing as this is the data where, this is what's happened in the past. We're using past trends and our discount on that based on past trends versus what I think most of us are thinking, which is some of the constraints, then how much could I do there? And I think that's a wonderful conversation. I hope we get there perhaps. I think it's a wonderful conversation for us to have. But because Bob, I agree. I look at that lot and I go, geez, wow, 60%. It's got to be better than that. Look at all that open space there. But at the same time, I hear over and over people trying to do some developments and those constraints are very, very real. A question I've got is on slide 24, you had a map of the areas that were being excluded. And I'm just wondering if Riverside, I'm wondering about the golf courses because those are big spaces. And I'm wondering if Riverside was considered excluded along with Colwood and Heron Lakes, because Colwood and Heron Lakes are parks. So I believe they would be excluded, but they're also golf courses just like Riverside. So,
Riverside is included. It's designated industrial in the comp plan. Or a portion of it is.
Part of Riverside.
Part of it.
Because last time, 2016, we changed the comp plan on sort of the eastern half of Riverside Golf Course, closer to the street, away from the whatever that slough dike is.
Yeah.
So half of, I don't know, half of Riverside is included in this as a future development potential.
Yeah. That's not very realistic. They have absolutely no.
They've gone back and forth. We got, after we did it and there was all the building, we got some calls from them saying, wait, hey, how do we do this?
In case you may want to include some at Colwood, for example. You know, so I just, it seems odd that you would, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we included that because of the industrial comp plan designation.
Yeah.
We're not including Heron Lakes and Colwood because it has an open space designation.
Yeah. That gets to some of Bob's concerns too, how, because when that happened, it goes back to a recommendation from Steve years ago of like, what if we applied this overlay, this industrial overlay onto all the golf courses in the area? And the side said, we're willing to look at that. We don't want to, but we're willing to, I encourage them to engage in the conversation. But Heron Lakes and Colwood, city-owned properties, immediately said, no, we don't want to even have the conversation, take us out of that. And then when we came back around, weeks, months later, to Riverside, at that point, they said, no, we don't want to be included, take us out. And you guys said, too late, you're in. So this gets to Bob's point. Let's be careful about how these things advance over time, and we never circle back to actually update our assumptions.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Corky. Other questions about the assumptions being made in the buildable lands inventory? I realize there's some follow-up to be done on some of the details.
I think maybe if, in the interest of
moving?
time,
Yeah.
we'll keep moving because the next step is really what we call the reconciliation of both taking the demand from Steve's forecast and the supply from Sam's analysis, and how does that match up? And so this is similar to the table that we had presented or shown previous that came out of the 2016. This is now using as a baseline similar format. So what you see in the two columns there on the left is the demand, the added jobs and how that converts in terms of building space to acres. And then in that middle column is the supply as we understand it right now. And then you begin to see the shortfalls, which is similar to the results that we had last time, which is if we took the baseline forecast and we have the supply that as we currently understand it, then there's about a 400 acre shortfall in meeting that sort of opportunity, that forecast opportunity in terms of future employment growth. What we need to get into is questions like this is like, well, what investments could we make to relieve some of those constraints? How far can that take us? Or, you know, Bob, you raise a good point. I think one of the issues about go back and check, but like some of those constraints apply to the whole site, and some of them, like the Greenway or the C zone, apply just to the land, that partial lot, that geographic coverage or the steep slope we take out, sort of thing. But this sort of is our starting point. And then over the next couple of meetings, we're going to get into different, what we call policy options around natural resource protection or brownfields or Superfund that can make these numbers go up and down. Because, you know, added natural resource protection is going to have an impact on that available supply. A brownfield program that helps accelerate brownfield cleanup is going to increase that supply. And so what we want to get to at the sort of end of this process is what is that combination that we can come together in terms of those different policy options. And then if we still have a shortfall, what are some of the other things that we can do? Can we boost middle wage job growth in the other sectors? You know, maybe Portland can't continue to have 75% of the warehouse and distribution jobs. What does that mean to the region? And both in terms of where can it locate or even outside the region, and what does that mean in terms of transportation impacts? But they're sort of, depending on the policy you're trying to solve for, there's different strategies. We also did, you know, as Steve said, back to sort of the goal 9 requirements and looking at site sizes. And this sort of gets back to Bob's earlier question about redevelopment. This is how that supply and demand plays out over the different site sizes. And what this shows is like a lot of the industrial demand is in 10 acres or larger. We don't have a lot of those parcels left. So are there things that we can do to aggregate parcels into larger sites? Or again, if that is where the demand is, we're going to have to look at, you know, what is constrained or what is elsewhere in the region to find larger sites. I think the one sort of good news, oh, we cut that slide, but the one good news here is Steve did an analysis, sort of that short-term 2030 forecast and supply, and there we, you know, sort of we have, even in the industrial areas, we have enough available capacity that is not severely constrained to kind of get us through the next business cycle. So we have time to make these investments to free up or create capacity over the long term. But sort of this sort of ledger sheet, and whether we're affecting the land or we're affecting the jobs, that's one lens that we use to evaluate the different policy choices.
Tom, could you, I'm sorry, real quickly, go to the other slide you had there?
The parcel size.
Yeah. Just a quick question on that. I mean, that's sort of good news on the 1 to 3, 1 to 10 acres lots, but you analyzed only for 3 acres and above.
Only for redevelopment sites in the industrial, kind of traditional industrial geographies.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, does that or potentially change your data here in the 1 to 3 acre columns?
For the industrial row.
It means it's not an issue. Our shortfall of industrial land is essentially in sites larger than 10 acres.
So those numbers might change.
And that's where we're seeing industrial redevelopment is on sites larger than 10 acres. We were pretty optimistic in saying, we think we can get it down to 3 acre size. But even so, actually there's demand across all of these site sizes, but we have more supply in the smaller site sizes where we have the shortfall is 10 acres and larger. And it adds another 100 acres to the shortfall.
So I just not worried about those small parcels.
Yeah, or that the redevelopment is like a constraint on those smaller parcels, right? You have to buy the building, you have to demo the building or alter the building. So we're not expecting to get a lot of new development capacity out of those smaller sites, especially when there appears to be an adequate supply out there already. So if you think about a developer going out or a business owner, like, okay, I'm looking for 2 acres. I've got lots of choice. Why would I buy this building and demolish it?
Thanks.
Questions, insights, thoughts about things you'd like to pick at as we move forward here? Bob, I see a question on your face.
I mean, tease out how, because this is pretty fine-tuned stuff, right? I mean, you know, you need X number of acres above this size, X number of acres above that size. I mean, how confident are you in those kinds of numbers around 438 on 20 plus acres or whatever it is?
Yeah, excellent question. This is basing the forecast by site size on development trends, new building construction trends in the industrial geography and similarly in the other geographies. So, you know, it's based on the most recent trends that we've seen. It's better data than we had last time on site size.
So,
and I'm not showing the demand table here, I'm just showing the reconciliation table. The demand table looks a lot more even. You can find it in the report that we sent out last week. This is just showing where we have a shortfall.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is it's just sort of that black box that we have sometimes around this that, you know, because it's kind of, it's based on sort of these proprietary interviews to some degree, right, with the industry as to what they think they're going to need. And
no, this was specifically on permit trends. It's all new construction within this geography, and we allocated it by site size.
Stuff that got built.
In those in each of the categories separately. Okay. Each of the 4 geographies.
So the interview part of it doesn't really come in that much?
No, not at all.
But it used to, right?
It's a good question, though.
All right,
it did influence in the last forecast, yes.
All right, no, that's helpful.
Progress, Rob.
It's good to know.
I guess I'm also harkening back to the last time we opened up tree code, for example, on particularly mature trees and how that impacts buildable land, particularly larger industrial parcels, and especially thinking of how the industrial land overlays with islands maps and looking at, you know, what the acceleration of our climate future is looking like, what we need to be building. I'm actually on the opposite side as you, like, are our constraints enough to be considering what is likely needed for something like, you know, I think of, for example, this is a short story. Every man has worked for Daimler. Like my brother was wrestling heat cabs, and it was 110 degrees inside the factory. That was when we had very different summers, and now we are having these summers. Like, what do we need to be planning for in terms of what workforce, like workplace survivability looks like in terms of tree canopy, and how that impacts what our projections are for in this buildable land, and particularly in larger parcels in East Portland.
Yeah, I think we'll get at it at 2 ways. One is, first, at the next meeting, we'll look at the environmental overlay zone mapping project, and that particularly applies to the Columbia corridor along the Columbia Slough. And so that'll look at different protections, especially related to sloughs and wetlands. It covers some of the trees, and I forget what percentage of trees in the industrial area are covered by an environmental overlay zone versus what may be more vulnerable to development. And then in a subsequent meeting, we'll actually get at that question, because when we looked at the trees, we applied the tree protection, tree planting standards to the general industrial zones, but not the heavy industrial zones. And so we'll come back and look at what that impact might be to require or apply, and there's some different choices there, whether you require preserving the existing trees or planting new trees. But that is one of sort of the policy options on the table to look at in sort of the big picture, like tree preservation, E-zones, impact on industrial land capacity, job opportunity, to try and do that all in a more integrated fashion as opposed to case by case.
Anything else someone wants to ask about? Interest in future conversation?
I will say for those in the room, we will collect the links that have been posted in the chat and share those out. We'll share out the presentation. We do have some of the buildable land inventory maps here on the wall. We'll send those out as well to folks. And keep moving on from there.
They are both included in the report that we got last week, both of these maps.
And as you think about this stuff, go back over the reports, please send us any questions you have. You know, it helps us in terms of how we present this, how we think about this. You know, Bob's question about the Greenway. There's a question here about Greenway and river related uses and how that interacts. So we'll look closer at that.
Additional questions?
Yeah, sorry, more kind of a comment, like what I've been thinking of, if that's okay. One, also, Tom, you totally sent me the materials for today. Sorry, I was catching up from one. So my apologies. The stars, you know, the fault lies not in our Toms, but in ourselves. I've also been thinking when we were talking about, you know, healthcare jobs, I come from the land of recency bias. In age-friendly Oregon Summit earlier this week, and you know, Portland is the first age-friendly city. We have one of the trends that we have benefited from are people who have, you know, getting retirement benefits from some other state and then coming to our fair shores and then spending it in retirement, which is great. Cool, thanks, team. But we have a dearth of, I mean, our pipeline of healthcare working jobs, particularly nursing jobs, is such that, you know, I think of that, and I also think of retail as, you know, what are those other factors that are building in opportunities for in-migration, particularly of retiring people, to be able to retire here and spend all of their money here that they, and what is the ecosystem that we need to be building? How does that, you know, and that was my question related to residential or institutional, like, living facility, you know, is that residential, is that institutional? And so, like, what are those trends in terms of, you know, intergenerational wealth coming in to our state, and what sectors do we need to be planning for and building for and paying attention to?
Thinking about the bigger economic opportunity in front of us. Yeah. Fair enough. Anything else? I really appreciate you all. These are, you know, sometimes difficult conversations. I really appreciate you being forthright in your opinions and being just sort of open-minded and really trying to work through this and understand it. It'll serve us well, and I welcome, and sort of being collegial and kind to one another, I welcome that in the future, and acknowledge there were questions in the chat. Tom, you recapped a couple of them. We'll make sure we capture all the questions and follow-up items and pick those up either before our next meeting or in our next meeting. So thank you all.
Thanks,
That's it. We'll see you soon. Do you have the next meeting date handy?
The next meeting is November 3rd, and we will be talking about Columbia Corridor environmental overlays.
Great. Thank you.
Go in, Nancy.